What was the Great Wall really built to do? Stop an enemy or manage an entire frontier world? If it was meant to be an impenetrable barrier, why did armies cross it, traders pass through it, and families live and die along its spine? Over the next 20 minutes, we are going to strip away the postcard myth and follow the wall as it actually worked. A chain of fortresses, gates, watchtowers, and rulebooks, built by human hands at staggering cost, designed not only to keep people out, but to control who could come in, when, and on what terms. By the end, you will see the Great Wall not as a single line, but as a living border system, one that shaped war, trade, and identity for more than 2,000 years. To understand the Great Wall, we have to begin by breaking the first illusion. There is no single Great Wall that sprang into being in one era, under one emperor, with one plan. What we call the Great Wall is a family of walls, built, rebuilt, abandoned, and reimagined by different states, in different landscapes, for different threats. It runs through mountains where stone can be stacked and mortared, and across deserts where tamped earth and mud brick were all builders had. In some places it is a towering rampart with crenellations. In others it is a low ridge, a line of packed soil fading into grass. The myth tells us it is solid and continuous. The reality is a frontier network: patrol roads, storage depots, signal towers, fortified passes, and garrison towns. The wall was never just the wall. It was bureaucracy made visible in earth and brick. Why build anything like it at all? Look north from the agricultural heartlands of China and you meet the steppe and the desert, open country that favors mobility. For farming societies, the problem was not only invasion, it was uncertainty. Mounted raiders could appear quickly, strike quickly, and vanish. A wall, in that context, is less like a castle wall around a city and more like a device that reshapes time. It slows movement. It funnels traffic toward gates. It forces an attacker to choose: assault a fortified point, attempt a risky bypass, or negotiate access. That difference between stopping and channeling is the key to almost everything we are about to see. Long before the first emperor, regional states during the Warring States period built their own frontier walls. They were not romantic monuments. They were hard borders in an age of constant conflict, drawn in soil and stone. When Qin unified China in 221 BCE, the new empire inherited a patchwork of defenses. Tradition remembers Qin Shi Huang ordering older walls linked and strengthened. But linking walls is not the same as sealing a continent. What emerged was a strategic belt, reinforced where it mattered, thin where it could be thin, and always dependent on manpower. And manpower is where the human cost enters, immediately and brutally. The wall's early construction relied on soldiers, conscripted peasants, and people condemned to labor as punishment. They worked in dangerous terrain, under harsh weather, hauling earth and stone without modern machines. Many never returned. We cannot count every death precisely, and we should not pretend we can, but we can say with confidence that large-scale forced labor and high mortality were part of the wall's earliest imperial story, and that countless families paid for security with years of absence, injury, hunger, and grief. If it was so costly, why did later dynasties keep building? Because the frontier problem never disappeared. It changed shape. Different nomadic confederations rose and fell. Climate and pasture conditions shifted. Political coalitions formed and broke. Each dynasty faced the same dilemma. How do you protect settled farmland and tax-paying villages from fast-moving pressure on the border without draining the state dry? Walls were one answer. Never the only answer. Often diplomacy mattered more. Sometimes trade mattered more. Sometimes paying, marrying, or negotiating mattered more. When walls were built, they were built as part of a broader system. This becomes clearer under the Han dynasty. In the centuries after Qin, the Han confronted the powerful Xiongnu Confederation to the north. The Han did build and extend frontier defenses, particularly in the northwest, into the Heshi Corridor, the narrow stretch of land between mountains and desert that acts like a hallway towards Central Asia. If you want to understand the Great Wall and trade, do not start with the scenic ridges near Beijing. Start here, where the route west becomes possible at all. Along this corridor, fortresses, watchtowers, and beacon platforms guarded not only against raids, but against chaos. The Han court wanted to secure communications, protect garrisons, and keep routes open enough to matter. Yet these defenses were not simply a giant NO. They were a controlled yes. Who could pass? Under what authority? With what goods? Under whose protection? Think about what that means in practice. A traveler is not just walking along a line. They are entering a world of permits, inspections, escorts, taxes, and storage. Border officials could restrict movement, collect duties, and monitor who was coming and going. Trade, in this frontier reality, was not a free-flowing river. It was a canal system, dug and regulated by the state. For merchants, that regulation could be both protection and pressure. A fortified route reduces the chance of sudden violence, but it also increases the power of those who control the gates. The wall's hidden frontiers are the places where economic life and military logic become inseparable. But even the Han learned a hard truth: a wall cannot defend itself. The frontier had to be inhabited, supplied, and governed. So the state used garrisons and, in some regions, encouraged or organized military farming. Soldiers who cultivated land to feed themselves and reduce supply burdens. Here the wall becomes something stranger: part battlefield, part farm belt, part administrative grid. Imagine the daily rhythm. A soldier farmer begins with irrigation and ends with patrol. The harvest is not only food, it is endurance. A bad season can weaken an outpost as effectively as an enemy raid. A wall is only as strong as the people who can stay behind it through winter. Now ask the question history forces on us. If the wall was so important, why do we see periods when it seems to vanish from the record, or when dynasties rely less on walls and more on other strategies? Because borders are not fixed. They move with politics. Sometimes states expanded outward, shifting the frontier beyond older lines. Sometimes they managed the steppe through alliances and trade. Sometimes they suffered internal weakness and could not sustain expensive defenses. The wall, in other words, was not a timeless solution. It was a choice, and like all choices it depended on money, manpower, and confidence. When does the Great Wall become the wall most people imagine today? The dramatic stone and brick ramparts snaking over mountains. That image is largely the work of the Ming dynasty, beginning in the late 1300s and continuing for centuries. The Ming faced a specific strategic environment. After the fall of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, the north remained dominated by powerful steppe forces capable of rapid raids and political pressure. The Ming response was not one construction project, but a long commitment to building, reinforcing, and staffing defensive lines, especially in the north and northeast. The Ming walls are the ones tourists often see because stone and brick survive better than tamped earth, and because many restored stretches lie near famous passes and routes associated with the capital. But even in the Ming era, the wall is really a frontier machine. Start with the passes, places where geography narrows movement and defense becomes possible. A pass is not merely a gap. It is where an army can be held, where a caravan can be inspected, where officials can say yes, no, or not without payment. Fortresses clustered around these passes, and along ridgelines, were built not as isolated castles but as nodes in a network. Around them were barracks, depots, workshops, stables, and roads, because a wall that cannot be supplied is only a future ruin. So how did the network work? Through visibility and speed. Watchtowers and beacon towers turned the frontier into an early warning system. Signals, smoke by day, fire by night, could carry alarms from one tower to the next, pushing news of an attack across long distances far faster than a rider alone. The exact codes and methods varied by time and place, but the principle stayed the same: transform a local raid into a regional alarm before the raiders vanish. The wall's real power was not that it stopped everything, it was that it made surprise harder. But warning is only useful if someone responds. That requires organized forces, readiness, and logistics. It means patrol roads, granaries, armories, and a chain of command able to mobilize quickly. All of that required money. And this is where the Great Wall becomes a story about budgets and institutions as much as stone. Fortifications consume resources even in peace. They demand salaries, repairs, and supplies. They produce paperwork. They create opportunities for corruption and survival strategies for local communities. Some towns prospered because garrisons needed food, cloth, and tools. Others suffered because taxes and requisitions were relentless. The frontier could be an economic engine and a grinding weight at the same time. This is also where the myth of an impenetrable barrier begins to crack in plain sight. If the wall is purely a wall, why are there so many gates? Because frontier management often required controlled interaction. States needed horses, livestock, and political calm. Steppe groups wanted grain, textiles, metal goods, and prestige items. Trade could be a tool of diplomacy, a pressure valve, and a battleground in its own right. When official channels were open, commerce could be monitored and taxed. When they were closed, smuggling and violence often increased. The wall was an instrument for deciding how much contact the state could tolerate. Picture a border market day. Not the romantic Silk Road fantasy, but a tense, regulated exchange under watch. Soldiers stand on towers. Officials check documents. Merchants negotiate under rules that might change with the season or with the latest political crisis. On one side, a settled world of farms and walled cities. On the other, mobile societies with different rhythms, different needs, and different power structures. The wall becomes less like a final line and more like a membrane, selectively permeable, sometimes stiff, sometimes flexible, always political. So why does the myth of a perfect barrier persist? Because we love clean symbols. A wall is easy to understand. It is a story you can tell in one sentence. They built it to keep them out. Real history resists that simplicity. The Great Wall endured in memory because it is visible, monumental, and emotionally satisfying as a metaphor. It feels like determination made stone. Yet the same visibility hides its true nature. When you stand on a restored Ming section, you see the rampart. You do not see the permit system. You do not see the granaries. You do not see the watchtower ruin swallowed by desert. You do not see the countless lives that maintained the system long after the last brick was laid. The hidden frontiers are also hidden in geography. The wall is not only the famous mountain ridges. It stretches into harsh landscapes where survival itself is the first enemy. In arid regions, builders relied on local materials, tamped earth, gravel layers, mud brick, creating structures that could endure for centuries in dry climates and then crumble quickly when conditions changed. Here the frontier was not a scenic viewpoint, but a long, lonely obligation. Outposts were spaced by what a rider could reach, what a signal could span, and what a supply line could support. Those distances mattered. A fortress too far from water is a fortress that dies. A tower too close to the next wastes labor. Every decision was a negotiation with terrain. And terrain has its own politics. A mountain wall looks impressive, but mountains can be bypassed through passes. A desert wall can guide movement, but deserts also punish invaders. Sometimes nature was the real barrier, and the wall's job was to anchor control where nature alone was not enough. That is why the frontier system always includes forts, not just ramparts. A fort is a declaration. We are here, we can enforce rules here, we can survive here, at least for now. At this point, an uncomfortable question becomes unavoidable. Did the wall succeed? The honest answer is that it succeeded at some things, failed at others, and was never designed to achieve the impossible dream we project onto it. It could reduce small-scale raiding in some regions by increasing the risks of quick strikes. It could speed communication and response. It could protect certain corridors. It could stabilize frontier zones when paired with diplomacy and economic policy. But it could not stop major political transformations. When a powerful force emerged with the ability to coordinate large armies, exploit weak points, or win allies inside the system, the wall could be crossed. And it could be crossed not only by force, but by human choices. A wall is ultimately governed by gates, and gates are governed by people. This reality becomes stark in the 17th century, when the Ming dynasty faced deep internal crises and rising threats along the northeastern frontier. In 1644, Shanhai Pass, where the wall meets the sea, became a pivot point in history. The details involve rebellion and shifting alliances, but the lesson is clear: walls do not simply fall. They can be outmaneuvered by politics, fractured by internal collapse, and opened by decisions made under pressure. After the Qing dynasty consolidated power, the strategic map changed again. The frontier shifted, and many older wall lines became less central to defense. When borders move, walls become remnants of earlier calculations. Yet even when military relevance faded in some regions, the wall kept shaping lives. Sections became sources of building material for nearby villages, or boundaries for grazing, or landmarks in local memory. In other places, it remained a symbol of state power and identity. Over centuries, it transformed from a frontier system into a cultural monument. Modern restoration and tourism preserve parts of it, but they can also reinforce the simplified myth. One wall, one purpose, one story. The true story is more complex, because the wall's function was always tied to who held power, who was labeled an outsider, and who paid the cost of security. The wall also shaped culture in quieter ways. It reinforced an idea of inside and outside, even as it proved, in practice, that inside and outside were connected. Along the border, languages mixed, goods circulated, and identities blurred. Soldiers married locally. Traders learned to navigate multiple customs. Diplomats used gifts and rituals to translate power across worlds. The wall could sharpen difference in the imagination while enabling contact in daily life. That tension, between separation and exchange, is the heart of the Great Wall's hidden frontier. And the hidden frontier is, above all, a story of maintenance. Building a defensive line is one act of force. Keeping it alive is an act of routine, daily, seasonal, exhausting. Every tower needed fuel for fires, food for guards, fodder for animals, and constant repairs after storms, frost, and erosion. A wall is always being defeated by time. That is why the Great Wall was never only an engineering project. It was a permanent social contract imposed from above. You will live here, you will serve here, you will hold the edge. How did people build in places where there was no easy stone? In many northern and northwestern regions, the answer was rammed earth. Layers of soil and gravel compacted into hard, dense walls using wooden frames and repeated pounding. In deserts and dry basins, builders also used mud brick and sometimes reinforced layers with reeds and brush, depending on local materials. Where mountains provided stone, walls could be faced with masonry and strengthened with brick. This is why different parts of the same Great Wall can look like different civilizations built them. In a way, they did, because the wall was always a collaboration between the state's goals and the land's limits. But technique is only half the story. The other half is labor. For early dynasties, large projects often relied on corvée obligations, soldier labor, and penal labor. Under later dynasties, construction could draw on organized military units and regional systems of taxation and transport. The cost was not only the danger of building on cliffs or in deserts. It was the slow violence of displacement, fields left untended, families split, and communities pulled toward the frontier to make the frontier hold. A wall that looks empty in modern photographs was once crowded with the invisible infrastructure of survival. Carts, animals, wells, workshops, and the movement of people keeping a distant line from collapsing. This is where the hidden frontiers become human. Imagine the watchman in a tower, staring into wind and dust, trained to read the horizon for motion. Imagine the clerk at a gate, counting loads, checking seals, deciding who gets through. Imagine the messenger who rides hard to carry news that must arrive before the enemy does. Imagine the family that follows a garrison, selling bread, cloth, and tools, building a life in the shadow of defensive walls because the wall creates a market as surely as it creates a boundary. The Great Wall is sometimes called a triumph of engineering. It is also a record of labor and endurance, of ordinary lives pulled into a grand strategy they did not design. In the Ming period, the wall's frontier system became even more structured, because it had to be. Defending the north was not a single problem along a single line, but a chain of regional problems that shifted with seasons, politics, and pressure from different steppe groups. That is why Ming officials organized major stretches of the frontier into what later historians often call the 9 border garrisons, large defense zones that anchored troops, fortresses, supply depots, and command structures along key approaches. This was not just geography, it was an administrative map. Each zone had its own constraints. Mountain passes where an army could be stopped, river crossings where patrols mattered, open plains where mobility could overwhelm static defenses. The wall helped, but only when it was paired with a system that could feed soldiers, rotate units, and keep commanders accountable. That system demanded people, and the Ming tried to bind soldiers to the frontier through hereditary military structures. In practice, this meant many garrisons became semi-permanent communities, with soldiers and their families living in the orbit of forts and towers for generations. The promise was stability, a standing force that did not have to be raised from scratch every crisis. The reality was often harsher. When pay fell behind, when grain deliveries failed, or when corruption ate away at supplies, frontier soldiers turned to side work, local farming, or trade, sometimes legal, sometimes not. The border, once again, became a place where the state's rules met human improvisation. Every sealed gate created a temptation to slip through. Every restriction created a price for looking the other way. And the wall did not stand alone even within the Ming landscape. In some regions, multiple lines of defense existed, strong points and walls that formed depth rather than a single edge. A raid that slipped past one barrier might still be caught by another, or at least slowed long enough for a response. This layered approach reveals the wall's real logic. The goal was rarely to prevent all entry, but to control the speed and direction of movement. It is the same logic you find in fortified passes, where the wall concentrates stone, manpower, and authority into one narrow throat. A pass can be reinforced, resupplied, and governed. Open countryside cannot. So the wall repeatedly chooses the same answer. Do not defend everything. Defend the points that decide everything. When the system worked, the frontier felt predictable. Signal towers warned of movement. Patrols pushed threats toward places the state had prepared to fight. Gates regulated trade and diplomacy. But when the system faltered, the frontier became terrifyingly elastic. The 15th century offered a dramatic reminder when the Ming suffered a major shock in the north. The Tumu crisis of 1449, when the Zhengtong emperor was captured during conflict with the Oirat Mongols led by Izan. The details belong to military history, but the message echoes across every era of the wall. A border structure can slow an enemy, but it cannot compensate for poor decisions, broken coordination, or a state that overreaches. After such shocks, defenses were strengthened, rebuilt, reconsidered. The wall's most famous stone and brick expansions belong to this long cycle of threat, reform, and renewed construction. Travel west along the frontier, and the wall's relationship to trade becomes impossible to ignore. The farther you go, the more the border resembles a corridor rather than a single edge, and the more important the great gates and fortresses become. In the far northwest, places like Jiayu Pass, often remembered as the western end of the Ming Great Wall, stood not only as military anchors but as symbols of state-defined limits. Beyond, the world opened into the routes of Central Asia. Within, the state tried to keep order, collect taxes, and maintain the authority of its documents. For travelers and merchants, these gates could feel like both protection and pressure. Safety under the shadow of a fortress, and scrutiny under the eyes of officials. The wall's hidden frontier here is a frontier of paperwork and permission, where movement itself becomes something the state can approve, deny, or monetize. Now return to the question that changes how we see it all. What made the Great Wall powerful if it was not invincible? Not height, not length, not the fantasy of a perfect barrier. Its power was in organization, in systems, in the ability to turn geography into policy, and policy into daily routine. The Great Wall's fortresses, trade gates, and signal towers tell us something that feels modern. Borders are rarely just about stopping movement. They are about shaping it. They are about who controls the terms of contact between worlds. And that is the wall's final reveal. It did not simply divide China from the steppe. It connected them through controlled contact, trade when possible, violence when not, and constant bargaining in between. The wall did not solve the frontier. It organized it, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes brutally. It changed the tempo of conflict, the pathways of commerce, and the imagination of identity. It turned an edge into a system. So the next time you see the Great Wall in a photograph, do not ask only, how high is it? Ask, how did it work? Ask, who paid for it? Ask, where were the gates, and who held the keys? Because the Great Wall's true story is not the myth of an impenetrable barrier. It is the story of a frontier, built, maintained, negotiated, and lived. If this documentary helped you see the Great Wall as a living system rather than a single line, please Please like the video, subscribe for more historically grounded films, and leave a comment answering this. If you were advising an emperor, would you invest more in higher walls, stronger forts, or wider, controlled trade gates? And what do you think that choice would change about the wall's legacy?